Come here for a second. This is one of those conversations your school never had time for, but your life needed it. Not because it sounds deep, but because it explains a lot about how the world learned to look at us. See, some of the most powerful black faces in human history didn't disappear. They were changed, not broken by time, not lost in war, repainted. And once that happened, the story could move forward like nothing ever went missing. This isn't something I feel, it's documented. Ancient paintings and sacred images of black kings, queens, and holy figures were deliberately altered to remove their blackness, not just misread, not misunderstood, carefully revised during what they called restoration. Across Europe, the Mediterranean, and North Africa, images of rulers and saints originally painted with dark skin and African features were slowly lightened layer by layer, century by century, sometimes in churches, sometimes in museums, always with respectable language and quiet intentions. Take the Black Madonnas all over France, Spain, Italy, Poland. Hundreds of them originally painted dark on purpose, not from candle smoke, like they'll tell you, but because their blackness carried meaning tied to early African Christianity and ancient mother traditions. When Europe started getting uncomfortable with black holiness, many of those images were scrubbed, repainted, or swapped out. Or look at Saint Maurice, Roman commander, Christian martyr. Early records describe him as African. Early medieval paintings show him clearly black, armored, standing like a leader. Later versions keep his name and halo, but lighten his skin and drain his authority because a black military saint didn't fit the new order. Now, let's talk Egypt, because this is where folks get real quiet. Early European sketches of tomb paintings show pharaohs with deep brown skin. What you see in many museums today is lighter, not faded, altered. Infrared scans and pigment tests show darker layers underneath. That's not opinion. That's science doing the talking. Every restorer had the same choice. Leave the truth or make it match Europe's idea of greatness. Over and over again, they chose comfort over accuracy. This hits Black Americans in a way others don't always feel, because while our ancestors were being enslaved and told they had no civilization, black royalty was being wiped out of the visual record at the same time. That wasn't an accident. That was planning. You can't sell slavery if black kings still look like kings. You can't preach inferiority if black saints still look divine. So the images changed quietly, slowly, effectively. That's why some paintings feel wrong. Like the color doesn't belong to the face. Like the body tells one truth and the paint tells another, because the structure stayed African. Only the pigments change. This is how a people get separated from their legacy. First, the future gets stolen with chains. Then, the past gets stolen with paint. And after a while, folks start asking the wrong question. Not what was taken from us, but did we ever have anything at all? That's why this matters. That's why nobody rushed to teach you this. Because if you ever saw the originals clearly, you'd start asking questions they can't answer comfortably. Questions like why blackness had to be removed for Europe to feel legitimate. Questions like how many so-called white kings and saints were never white to begin with. So before we move on, sit with this. If they were willing to repaint black royalty to protect their story, what else about our past do you think they were comfortable changing? Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable, because repainting only works if there was something real there to repaint. You can't alter an image unless the original already told a story they didn't like. And that's the part they rush past. Before Europe decided what royalty was supposed to look like, artists painted what stood in front of them. No racial panic. No need to explain black faces away. When African kings, queens, and nobles ruled land, controlled trade routes, and sponsored churches, their images reflected reality. You can see it in the posture. Early paintings show figures seated, not standing, because sitting was a sign of authority. The ground belonged to them. You can see it in the jewelry. Thick gold collars resting naturally against dark skin, not floating awkwardly like later edits. You can see it in the crowns, wide and heavy, designed for heads used to carrying power. Look at early depictions of Ethiopian emperors in Christian manuscripts. Dark-skinned rulers crowned, robed, holding crosses and scrolls. No explanation, no apology. They are presented as equal to any European king on the page, because at the time, they were. Look at Moorish Spain. Early illustrations of Andalusian courts show our black and brown rulers surrounded by scholars, physicians, and poets. Dark skin isn't emphasized. It's assumed because Africa wasn't foreign to Europe then. It was foundational even in Italy. Early Renaissance sketches and underdrawings revealed darker complexions beneath later paint. Infrared scans show that figures later presented as pale were first blocked in with brown tones. The posture stays confident. The pigment changes, and that sudden loss of accurate dark skin depiction just happens to line up with Europe deciding black people belonged at the bottom. Funny how that works without needing to be explained. The source of these images was African presence at the center of power. North African dynasties controlling the Mediterranean, Ethiopian Christianity, older than most European kingdoms, Egypt's legacy still alive through bloodlines, not just ruins. These weren't myths, these were living societies. That's why early Christian art includes black saints without footnotes. Saint Maurice, Saint Manas, black figures crowned, armored, divine. No museum label whispering symbolic. They didn't need one. But once Europe's racial hierarchy hardened, those same images became inconvenient because the source contradicted the new story. A story where civilization flowed in one direction. A story where blackness could not equal authority. So instead of deleting the past, they filtered it. They took images rooted in African power and slowly ran them through a European lens until the source was barely visible. Still there, just faint enough to deny. That's why restorers didn't erase everything. Too many churches were built around these figures. Too many copies existed. Too many travelers had already described them. So power did what it always does when it can't destroy something outright. It reframed it. Dark became shadowed. African became exotic. Royal became legend. Same image, new explanation. And once that explanation stuck, the source faded from memory. Viewers stopped asking where the authority came from. Stop wondering why Africa was everywhere in the foundation, but nowhere in the credit. So, when you hear someone say, we don't really know what they look like, understand what's really being said. Knowing would force a rewrite, and rewrites threaten comfort, but the source never vanished. It's still under the paint, still in the posture, still in the proportion, still whispering the truth if you know how to look. And that leads us straight into the next problem. If African power was the source they buried, how many missing pieces did they have to remove to keep that source from being obvious? Once you understand the source was African power, the next question comes naturally. What had to be removed to keep you from seeing it clearly? And the answer is simple. Pieces went missing, not in a dramatic blaze, not with alarms ringing, just quietly enough to fracture the picture. Because history doesn't fall apart when you pull out any brick. It falls apart when you pull out the ones holding the weight. Start with the words, not burned in some movie scene, just ignored, left untranslated, left unpublished, left sitting in the archives while news textbooks acted like they never existed. Ibn Battuta, the 14th century Moroccan traveler, wrote about the African empire of Mali, that its people were rarely unjust and have a greater abhorrence of injustice than any other people. That's an African civilization being described as morally disciplined, organized, and lawful. You never heard that quote in school. Aurelio Africanus, writing in the 1500s describing Timbuktu, said, "Here are great stores of doctors, judges, priests, and other learned men that are bountifully maintained at the king's cost." African kings funding education, paying scholars, running cities of learning. That line didn't age well once Europe decided Africa had no systems worth mentioning. So those voices faded out. Then the faces, early paintings, icons, and mosaics often included inscriptions, names, titles, origins, Ethiopian, Nubian, African. Later restorations kept the halo and dropped the context. Same saint, same crown. No explanation why the earliest versions show African features and darker skin. That missing sentence does damage because when context disappears, confusion moves in. And confusion is easier to manage than truth. Look at medieval church art. African figures didn't vanish overnight. They were repositioned, once central, now off to the side, once enthroned, now standing, once crowned, now holding something for someone else. Same walls, different hierarchy. That wasn't accidental. And Egypt keeps forcing its way back into the conversation, whether folks like it or not. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described Egyptians as black-skinned and woolly-haired. That's not a modern activist. That's one of Europe's most quoted ancient historians. But that line rarely makes it into museum tours because African doesn't fit the later script. Here's the quiet genius of the eraser. Africa wasn't removed from the art. Africa was removed from the explanation. So now, when you see African features in ancient imagery, you're told it's symbolic, a servant, a metaphor, something abstract. Funny how symbolism only shows up when African authority is on display. The missing pieces aren't just quotes and faces, they're timelines. Africa doesn't enter history for most African Americans until slavery begins. Everything before that gets treated like a rumor, a sidebar, something you can explore later if there's time. And when you start the story that late, African people only appear in chains, never in crowns. That's not an accident. That's architecture. Even the handling of art tells a story. This is a darker pigments fade faster under harsh lighting. Instead of preserving them, restorers often correct them. But notice the correction always goes one way. Lighter, always lighter, because fading is easier to explain than African royalty. And here's another piece they hope you never line up side by side. Early copies, engravings, traveler sketches, those often show African faces darker than the paintings hanging today. Same pose, same authority, same crown, different skin. Museums rarely show them together because comparison breaks the spell. For African Americans, these missing pieces hit different. You're told your ancestors gave rhythm but not reason, style but not systems, culture but not command. That lie didn't start in America. It was imported, already polished, already backed by a carefully edited past. That's why questioning it makes people uncomfortable, not angry, uneasy, because you're not debating opinion. You're reconnecting fragments that were never meant to touch again. Once you see what's missing, patterns show up everywhere. Gaps where an African dynasty should be, silences where African scholars should be quoted, paintings where the body says one thing and the label says another. And that's when it clicks. The erasure wasn't total, it was surgical. They didn't need to delete everything. They just needed to remove enough pieces so the picture couldn't explain itself, because a confused people argue with each other. A connected people challenge power. So sit with this. If these African voices, faces, and facts were removed to protect the narrative, what happens when Afrikaners start putting them back exactly where they belong? Let's bring it back tight to the wall, the canvas, the throne. Repainting only mattered because African authority was already visible, documented, dated, named. You don't spend centuries adjusting faces unless those faces once carried undeniable power. Start with Kemet, what later Europe renamed Egypt to soften the African reality. As early as 2600 BCE during the Old Kingdom, African pharaohs like Djoser and Khafre were ruling a centralized state with taxation, medical systems, and engineering that modern scholars still study. Wall paintings and reliefs from this period show rulers painted reddish brown to dark brown, consistent with Nile Valley Africans. When Napoleon scholars arrived in 1798, they sketched what they saw. Those sketches are darker than what many museums display today. That's not imagination. That's a before and after. Move forward to Nubia and Kush. Between roughly 800 BC ECE and 350 CE, African rulers from Napata and Moroya didn't just influence Egypt, they ruled it. Pharaohs like Pa and Tahara of the 25th dynasty governed both Nubia and Egypt. Tahara's statues, originally carved with full African features, were later defaced, recarved, or recontextualized. His reign is dated. His name is carved in stone. His image still gets debated because his existence messes with the story. Look at Ethiopia. The kingdom of Aksum was established by the 1st century CE and became a major world power by the 4th century. King Anna converted to Christianity around 330 CE, making Ethiopia one of the earliest Christian nations on earth. Medieval European manuscripts depict Ethiopian emperors crowned and dark-skinned, ruling Christian states centuries before England or France unified. Later, reproductions lighten those same figures and label them exotic. Funny how pioneers become side characters. Now, Moorish Spain. From 711 CE until 1492, African and Afro-Arab rulers governed Al-Andalus. Cities like Cordoba had street lighting, libraries, universities, and public baths. While much of Europe was still fragmented, early European illustrations and descriptions openly described Moorish rulers as dark-skinned Africans. By the time later Renaissance art revisits these scenes, the faces shift lighter, the African presence blurred into Mediterranean. Same dates, same cities, different faces. And let's talk wealth, because dates don't lie. In 1324, Mansa Musa of the Mali Empire traveled to Mecca. His gold was so abundant, it disrupted economies in Cairo for years. European maps from the 14th century literally show him seated on a throne, crowned holding gold. African royalty on European maps. Over time, later reproductions soften his features and downplay his authority. But the original calligraphy is still dated, still archived. Africa wasn't first in theory. Africa was first on record. You know what I mean? So when you see repainting, it's not random. It follows power shifts after 1492, after the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, after Europe needed Africans at the bottom to justify an economy built on extraction. That's when restorations start correcting skin tones. That's when African rulers become ambiguous. That's when authority gets reassigned. This is why African Americans feel the disconnect. You're looking at art that once told the truth, now edited to feel safe. The dates still line up. The names are still there. Only the faces changed. Africa being first isn't a detour. It's the motive. Because once you admit Africans and civilizations were leading from 2600 BCEE through the Middle Ages, repainting African royalty stops looking like art maintenance and starts looking like narrative defense. So here's the question that matters now. If these names and dates were solid enough to threaten European superiority, who exactly decided they needed to be painted over? And what were they trying to protect when they did it? Now listen to me. Stories don't rewrite themselves. Paint doesn't move on its own. Somebody had to decide those faces needed changing, and somebody had to benefit from it. And it wasn't regular folks. The shift starts showing up heavy between the late 1400s and the 1800s. That window matters. 1492 wasn't just Columbus sailing west. It was also the fall of Granada, the last Moorish stronghold in Spain, the final removal of African and Afro-Arab rule from European land. Right after that, the transatlantic slave trade doesn't crawl. It explodes. The timing ain't luck. Once Europe decided African people were property, African authority became a threat. You can't build a global system of enslavement while church walls still show African kings, African saints, and African scholars standing tall and dignified. So the cleaning started. The Catholic Church was right in the middle of it, not just preaching, governing. From the 15th through the 18th centuries, church-led restorations altered sacred images all across Europe. Saint Maurice, an African Roman commander and Christian martyr, once painted proudly dark in medieval Germany and Switzerland, starts showing up lighter, repositioned, less commanding. Same saint, same story, different lesson on the wall. And don't miss why churches mattered so much. Churches were the classroom. What people saw there became truth long before textbooks existed. Then came the scholars, Renaissance thinkers, Enlightenment men, folks like Johann Friedrich Blumenbach in the late 1700s, slicing humanity into racial categories and quietly sliding Africans to the bottom. Once that thinking took hold, history had to fall in line. Art had to fall in line because a racial ladder don't work if Africans are clearly first. Museums followed right behind the British Museum, the Louvre, the Vatican collections. These institutions came together in the 18th and 19th centuries, inheriting already altered works and doubling down. Restoration departments were staffed by men trained to believe European whiteness equaled civilization. When they found darker layers under the paint, they didn't see truth. They saw something that needed fixing, so they fixed it. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 tells the same story. His scholars documented African features. Honestly, at first, those early drawings are still archived. But later, publications softened skin tones and reframed Egypt as a Mediterranean, not African, because France wanted Egypt as heritage, not as competition. Then colonialism kicked into full gear. By the mid-1800s, Europe was carving Africa up like meat. You can't invade a continent while admitting it once led the world. So African empires became tribes and African kings became chiefs. African governance became primitive. Words do damage before bullets ever do. And while all this was happening, African Amines were fighting just to survive plantations, lynchings, and laws designed to break them. Meanwhile, Europe was perfecting a global story where African people had never ruled anything worth respecting. That lie didn't just justify slavery, it justified segregation, colonization, and a whole lot of silence. The art had to match the lie. So, no, restorations weren't neutral. They followed money, they followed power. They followed whoever needed to sleep good at night, believing they were on top for a reason. Nobody had to sit in a room and say, let's erase Africa. The system handled that on its own. Anyone who reinforced European dominance got rewarded. Anyone who challenged it got ignored, laughed at, or buried. That's why African faces faded as European empires rose. That's why African authority suddenly became symbolic. That's why African contributions got downgraded to influences. And once that story locked in, it trained generations to defend it without even realizing they were doing the defending. So, let me leave you with this. If churches, scholars, and empires all had something to gain from repainting African royalty, how much of what you were taught was history and how much of it was maintenance of power. Now, let me talk to you the way an older uncle would. Low voice, real steady. Because this part right here explains more than people like to admit. You don't have to keep a foot on somebody's neck if you can convince them they were never meant to stand tall in the first place. And the fastest way to do that is through images. What people see becomes what they accept. In medieval Europe, most folks couldn't read a sentence. Images were the classroom. Church walls were the textbooks. Paintings taught people who was chosen, who was powerful, who God favored. So when African saints and African rulers were lightened, pushed to the background, or quietly removed, the lesson changed without a single sermon being rewritten. That's how power moves when it wants to stay clean. Once African royalty stopped appearing as the standard of authority, authority itself started looking European by default. Holiness looked European. Intelligence looked European. Leadership looked European. And African people were slowly trained to see themselves everywhere except the top. That training didn't end with churches. By the 1700s and 1800s, museums and textbooks took over the job. Same message, new packaging. African people show up as labor, as raw material, as the beginning of a problem somebody else solves. Rarely, as architects of systems still running today, that repetition matters. Psychologists have a term for it now. Symbolic annihilation. When the people are absent from images of power long enough, the absence starts feeling natural. African Americans didn't just inherit oppression. They inherited a visual world designed to make greatness feel foreign. That's why representation hits deeper than people want to commit. It doesn't just inspire, it retrains expectation, and Europe understood that early. So once African authority was removed, it had to be replaced consistently. Same pale kings, same pale saints, same pale philosophers over and over again until the mind stopped asking questions. Repetition builds belief. That's why when African Americans question history today, folks say it's emotional, as if emotion isn't a response to manipulation. As if centuries of conditioning should disappear because someone says, that was a long time ago. No, this isn't about feelings. It's about deprogramming because the mind remembers what it's shown repeatedly, not what it's told once in passing. And this conditioning didn't stay in Europe. It crossed the Atlantic. Plantation churches, early American school books, children's illustration, same hierarchy, same imagery. African people shown as bodies, not builders, workers, not thinkers. And African Americans were expected to accept that as normal. But here's the part they never accounted for. Memory survives images. Elders pass down truths quietly. Barber hops, kitchens, cookouts, places where history doesn't need permission to breathe. That's why resistance never disappeared. It just stayed informal. And now the old narrative is nervous because once African Americans recognize how images shape the mind, the spell weakens. You start seeing how repainting a saint affects how a child imagines God, how repainting a king affects how people imagine leadership, how repainting history affects how long injustice can survive unchecked. Control the image, control the mind. That rule never expired. It just upgraded. So sit with this question. If centuries of images were used to train African Americans to doubt their place in history, what happens when those images get exposed and replaced with the truth? Now, here's the part they never say out loud. Europe wasn't just uncomfortable with African power. Europe was afraid of it. Not emotionally, strategically, because African knowledge threatened the entire hierarchy they were trying to build. Power can tolerate ignorance. It cannot tolerate comparison. Once African royalty was repainted and pushed into the background, the next danger was African knowledge still speaking for itself. Books, math, medicine, astronomy, governance, all of it whispered the truth. Europe couldn't afford to hear clearly. Africans didn't just rule. Africans understood, and that scared people. Look at what Europe encountered when it came into direct contact with African civilizations between the 1100s and the 1500s. In Moorish Spain, African and Afro-Arab scholars were teaching algebra, optics, medicine, philosophy, and astronomy. While much of Europe was still framing knowledge through superstition, universities in Paris and Oxford were built on translated African and Islamic texts. Europe didn't invent the foundation, it inherited it. And inheritance makes people nervous when they want to claim originality. African mathematicians preserved and expanded Greek knowledge. African physicians wrote medical texts used in Europe for centuries. Ibn Sina's canon of medicine, rooted in Afro-Asiatic scholarship, was taught in European universities into the 1600s. But notice how the African context gets trimmed off while the knowledge stays. Same pattern as the paintings. Keep the structure, change the face, and Egypt again refuses to be quiet. African mastery of geometry, surveying, and astronomy wasn't theoretical. It was practical. You don't align pyramids to cardinal directions with that level of precision by accident. You don't build monuments that last thousands of years without advanced understanding of engineering and time. European scholars knew this. They wrote about it. Then later, generations softened the language, reframed Africa as a cradle instead of a continuing civilization, because a cradle suggests infancy, not mastery. Africa being advanced wasn't the problem. Africa being advanced first was. Now think about this from Europe's position. You're trying to justify conquest, slavery, colonization, and the people you're exploiting have a documented history of kings, scholars, scientists, and sacred law, older than yours. That's a moral problem, philosophical problem, a legitimacy problem. So the knowledge had to be neutralized, not destroyed, just disconnected from African people. That's why African science became Greek, African medicine became Islamic, African philosophy became Mediterranean. Same ideas, new labels, safer labels. And once that separation was complete, Africa could be painted as empty behind, waiting to be rescued, waiting to be ruled. That lie was necessary for African Americans. This fear still echoes because when people hear African history framed with authority, they get defensive. Not curious, defensive, because it threatens a version of the world they've been trained to protect. That's why the pushback is always emotional, mockery, dismissal. Why does it matter? That question only shows up when something matters a lot. Europe wasn't terrified of African people as bodies. It was terrified of African people as proof. Proof that intelligence, order, and sovereignty didn't belong to one race. Proof that hierarchy was invented, not natural. And that's why repainting royalty was only the beginning. Because once African faces were lightened, African knowledge could be relabeled. Once African knowledge was relabeled, African people could be exploited without contradiction. Everything lined up. So here's the question to sit with. Now, if African knowledge was powerful enough to scare empires into rewriting history, what happens when African start reclaiming not just the faces, but the wisdom that once stood behind them? And here's where it circles right back to the walls and the canvas. Because African knowledge didn't just travel in books. It traveled in images, in illuminated manuscripts, in icons, in court paintings, in church art, meant to teach the world who carry wisdom and authority. Before Europe felt the need to correct the visuals, African scholars and rulers were shown teaching literally. Manuscripts from Ethiopia, North Africa, and Moorish Spain between the 900s and 1400s depict African figures seated with students, scrolls open, fingers raised mid-instruction, dark-skinned teachers, light-skinned students, no commentary, no defensiveness, just reality. Those images mattered because in a world where most people learned by looking, seeing African authority normalized African intelligence. Seeing African rulers sponsor learning made African leadership make sense. And that's exactly what had to be interrupted. Take medieval European manuscripts influenced by Andalusian scholarship. Early illustrations show African and Afro-Arabra scholars alongside European clerics, often positioned centrally. Later copies of the same text quietly alter the illustration. Same lesson, same text. The teacher's skin lightens. The African presence fades into the margins. Nobody announces it. It just happens. And when African rulers funded centers of learning, they were painted as patrons. Mansa Musa didn't just appear on maps holding gold in the 1300s. He appeared crowned, seated, commanding space. That image told the truth too loudly, so later reproductions softened it. Less posture, less presence, more myth than man. Because authority, once seen, is hard to unsee. Church art followed the same rule. Early depictions of African saints weren't symbolic teaching tools, they were literal examples. Saint Maurice standing armored, Saint Manus enthroned. African holiness shown as instructive. But as European racial hierarchy hardened, those images were adjusted, so the lesson changed. African wisdom became abstract, African leadership became local, African authority became historical noise. The teaching didn't stop, the visuals did. This is why repainting royalty mattered so much. Because if African faces stayed attached to teaching, ruling, and sanctity, the lie couldn't survive. You can't preach African inferiority while African images are still doing the instructing. And African Americans feel this gap, even if they can't always name it. You were taught ideas without seeing yourself as the source. You were taught systems without seeing African hands building them. You were taught wisdom with the faces removed. That separation does something deep. Because once the image disconnects from the idea, ownership disappears. Knowledge becomes something you borrow instead of something you inherit. Power becomes something you request instead of something you remember. That's why the repainting wasn't random. It followed education. It followed teaching spaces. It followed anywhere African authority might still be learned visually. They didn't just repaint kings. They repainted teachers. They repainted legitimacy. And once that was done, the next step was easy. Well, if African people were no longer shown teaching the world, then the world could pretend it taught itself. So here's the question pressing forward now. If African authority had to be visually removed to stop the lesson from spreading, what happens when African Americans start restoring not just the images, but the meaning those images were meant to teach? Here's what happens after the repainting is done and the meaning gets stripped out. The final step isn't dramatic. It's subtle. It's the slow cleaning of the story so nothing looks stolen anymore. Because once an image has been altered, somebody has to explain why it looks the way it does now. That's where captions come in, not lies, just language. An African ruler becomes a figure of unclear origin. An African saint becomes a regional interpretation. A visibly African face becomes darkened due to age, smoke, or artistic convention. The paint did its job earlier. Now the words make sure you don't question it. And this part is important. So listen close. Whitewashing doesn't argue against African presence. It buries it under uncertainty because certainty is dangerous. Certainty makes people investigate. Uncertainty makes people shrug and move on. Museums learned that lesson well. You'll see a figure with African features, African posture, African styling, and the plaque will say just enough to keep you from asking the obvious question. No dates tied to Africa, no lineage mentioned, no connection drawn, just enough vagueness to keep the image from pointing back to a people. That's not sloppy scholarship. That's maintenance. And this is where African Americans feel the disconnect without always knowing why. You're looking at something that feels familiar, powerful, almost like it's calling you, but the explanation tells you it's not yours. That tension isn't imagination, it's design. Because once the image is divorced from its African context, it becomes neutral property. Anyone could claim it. Everyone can admire it. Nobody has to credit the source. But that's how ownership disappears without resistance. This process didn't require inventing new history. It required narrowing it, shortening timelines, cutting off before African dominance and picking back up after European ascent. Everything in between becomes fog. And fog is useful because in fog, patterns disappear, connections weaken, responsibility fades. That's why African authority in art often gets described as early, primitive, or transitional. Those words don't sound hostile. They sound academic, but they quietly tell the viewer, don't take this too seriously. This isn't the main story. Meanwhile, European authority is framed as complete, mature, universal, no qualifiers needed, same images, different treatment. And when African Americans push back on that, The response is predictable. You're reading too much into it. History is complicated. Why does race matter? Questions that sound reasonable until you realize they only show up when African authority is being discussed. Nobody asks why European kings are always European. This slow cleaning is why repainting works so well. The visuals were altered first, then the language made the alteration feel natural. Over time, the edited version became the only version most people ever saw. No confrontation needed, just patience. That's how you end up with a world that can accept African suffering easily, but struggles to imagine African sovereignty. Not because the evidence isn't there, but because the story was cleaned until the evidence stopped pointing anywhere specific. And once specificity is gone, accountability follows. So now we're standing at a different kind of crossroads. Not about whether African royalty existed. That's settled. Not about whether images were altered. That's documented. The real question now is this. If the story was cleaned so thoroughly that generations stopped recognizing African authority when they saw it, what happens when African Amiens start reintroducing specificity back into the picture? Names, places, lineages, and all. All right, now let's move the camera. Same crime, different method, because at a certain point, paint stopped being sufficient. When the image still told too much truth, they stopped repainting and started reshaping. This is where sculpture enters the conversation. Stone, marble, bronze, harder to alter quietly, but not impossible. And when African authorities showed up carved into faces that wouldn't fade with time, the solution got more physical. Look at ancient statues across Egypt, Nubia, and the Mediterranean. Notice what's missing first. Noses, lips, facial features. Not the crown, not the throne, not the inscription naming the ruler, just the parts that signal African identity. That pattern isn't subtle. Noses don't fall off evenly across civilizations. Time doesn't selectively target African features and spare everything else. That kind of damage has intent written all over it. In ancient quite statues of African pharaohs, like Amenhotep III, Akhenaten and Tahara show deliberate facial mutilation, not erosion, chiseling, controlled strikes to the nose and mouth. European scholars have documented this for decades, but it's always framed as religious defacement or ritual damage. Funny how ritual always seems to land on the same features because the face carries memory. You can leave the crown and still change the story if the face no longer speaks clearly. You can leave the throne and still break the lineage if the features stop pointing back to Africa. This wasn't random destruction. It followed power shifts. When new rulers took over, especially foreign ones, African faces became a problem. Carved in stone, paint could be changed quietly. Stone required force, and the same logic followed into Europe. Roman busts originally modeled after African and Afro-Mediterranean rulers were copied, idealized, and standardized. Later, reproduction softened features, narrowed noses, smoothed lips. The name stayed, the face evolved. That's not artistic improvement. That's adaptation to ideology. Because as racial hierarchy hardened, African physiognomy couldn't be allowed to signal authority. Not in paint, not in stone, not anywhere permanence lived. African Americans feel this even today when statues are debated. The fight is always about who gets immortalized because permanence matters. Temporary images can be ignored. Stone demands reckoning. That's why defacement shows up again and again where African authority once stood. It's the same instinct as repainting, just louder. If the image can't be reinterpreted safely, it has to be damaged. And, ooh, notice something else. When African features are removed, the statue doesn't get discarded. It stays on display because once the face is neutralized, the figure becomes acceptable history. That's the cold part. They didn't want to destroy African greatness. They wanted to disconnect it from African people. Paint was the first tool, stone was the second, and both served the same goal. So now the picture widens. It wasn't just canvases and icons, it was monuments. It was public memory. It was who deserved to last. Which brings us straight to the next question. If African faces had to be altered, even in stone, to make history safe, what does that tell you about how dangerous the unaltered truth really was? And once stone started getting reshaped, the motive got even clearer. Because paint you can explain away, stone lasts, stone testifies. And when African authority was carved into material meant to outlive empires, somebody decided that truth was too permanent. This wasn't new behavior. The Romans had a term for it long before Europe mastered it. Damnio memoriale. Condemn the memory. Remove the face. Let the name stay if it has to, but break the image so the story can be retold later. Power has always known the face is the most dangerous part. Now watch how that plays out with dates attached. Between roughly 1500 and 1900, European expeditions flooded Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Near East. Not just soldiers, scholars, collectors, antiquarians. In 1798, when Napoleon invaded Egypt, his scholars documented statues, reliefs, and monuments in detail. Early plates from description delegates show African facial features more clearly than many restorations you see today. Same statues, same proportions, different faces. By the mid-1800s, as museums like the British Museum and the Louvre expanded, statues were cleaned, repaired, and sometimes completed. That word sounds harmless, but completion often meant reshaping noses, smoothing lips, and standardizing faces to match European ideals of beauty and authority. Johann Joachim Winckelmann, writing in the mid-70s and considered the father of art history, openly praised noble simplicity and quiet grandeur in classical sculpture, traits he associated with European features. That philosophy didn't stay theoretical. It guided restoration decisions. African physiognomy didn't fit the aesthetic, so it got corrected. That's not erosion, that's taste enforced with tools. Look again at statues of Amenhotep III, dated to around 1386, 1349 BCE. Original depictions show broad noses and full lips consistent with the Nile Valley Africans. Many surviving statues have noses deliberately removed, not chipped, not weathered, struck, clean breaks at the bridge, same damage pattern repeated across sites. Or Tuharqa, the Nubian pharaoh of the 25th dynasty, ruled in Egypt around 690 BCE. His statues were systematically defaced after foreign powers reclaimed control. Faces damaged, inscriptions attacked, authority targeted. That wasn't vandalism. That was political messaging carved in stone. And here's the part museums rarely emphasize. When statues of European rulers lose noses, it's treated as unfortunate damage. When African rulers lose noses, it's treated as time. Same outcome, different explanation. Because explanation controls memory, African Amines feel this even without knowing the dates. You walk through a museum And notice how many ancient faces look unfinished, broken, neutral, and your body senses something was taken from them. That intuition isn't mystical, it's historical. Stone doesn't forget how it was struck, and the goal was never to destroy African authority completely. It was to make it ambiguous. A faceless ruler is easier to reassign. A broken face can be claimed by anyone. That's why statues with African inscriptions were kept, displayed, studied, but their faces were allowed to remain damaged, because once the features stop speaking, the label can say whatever it wants. This is the same logic as repainting, just louder and more permanent. If the image can't be safely edited, it must be neutralized. And that leads us forward, because when paint and stone weren't enough, the final battlefield wasn't material at all. It was time itself. So here's the question moving us into the next layer. If African authority had to be silenced in paint and broken in stone, what do you think happens when history itself became the medium they could reshape? And this is where it goes from art crime to timeline robbery. Because once paint and stone couldn't fully quiet African authority, the last move was to move the clock, shift dates, rename eras, break continuity. If you can't deny what happened, you make it seem like it happened too long ago to matter. That trick is old. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, European scholars started reorganizing world history into ancient, classical, medieval, and modern. Sounds harmless, clean, organized, but notice who gets placed where. African civilizations get pushed deep into ancient, frozen in time. Europe gets the modern, the progress, the momentum. Same events, different framing. Take Cage again. Greek writers like Diodorus in the 1st century BCE said plainly that Greek law, philosophy, and religion were learned from Egypt. His words, Egyptians were the inventors of laws and customs. That's not vague. That's direct. But later, European timelines treat Egypt as a closed chapter. Important, but disconnected. A starter pack, not a living lineage. So, Africa becomes a prologue. Europe becomes the story. Now, watch how dates get used to blur continuity. The Kingdom of Kush ruled parts of Egypt during the 25th dynasty around 747,656 BCE. African pharaohs named recorded, but textbooks often present this as a brief interruption, not a legitimate period of African rule. Same length of time as some European dynasties, but framed smaller. Language shrinks power. Or look at Ethiopia. The Solomonic dynasty begins in 1270 CE and rules continuously into the 20th century. That's over 600 years of African monarchy, longer than most European royal lines. Yet, it rarely gets treated as a continuous civilization. It's fragmented into biblical, medieval, modern, as if it never moved forward on its own terms. Because continuity implies legitimacy, even Moorish rule in Iberia gets timed out of relevance. From 711 to 1492, nearly 800 years, universities, libraries, hospitals, urban planning. But when Europe retells it, Al-Andalus becomes a period, not a foundation. Something that happened to Europe, not something that shaped it. Edward Gibbon, writing in the late 1700s, admitted that Europe's reawakening followed contact with African and Islamic learning. But later, retellings credit Europe with rediscovering knowledge on its own. Same knowledge, new clock. And here's the cold part. Once African authorities push far enough back in time, it stops threatening the present. people saw that was impressive. For then, as if leadership expires, as if legacy has a shelf life, African Americans hear that message constantly. That was ancient. That doesn't apply now. As if European history doesn't reach back just as far, only with pride instead of dismissal. Time becomes a weapon when it's unevenly applied. This is why repainting royalty matters so much, because images anchor time. A face makes history feel present. Break the face, lighten the skin, shift the date, and suddenly African authority feels distant, abstract, safe. But the clock didn't actually stop. African societies didn't vanish. They were interrupted, invaded, exploited, but not erased. The timeline was cut, not ended. And when timelines get cut, people forget how to trace themselves backward. That's the real danger, because once African Americans lose the sense of continuity, identity becomes survival instead of inheritance. You start from struggle instead of sovereignty. So sit with this one. If African authority had to be pushed further and further back in time to keep it from challenging the present, what happens when African Americans start pulling that timeline forward again, unbroken, named, and undeniable? And once time itself got stretched and distorted, the lie needed one more layer, distance. Because if African authority could be kept on the other side of the ocean, then it could be dismissed as unrelated to African Americans altogether. That's when the story of the Americas got sealed shut. We're taught 1492 like it's a birth certificate, as if nothing counted before Columbus showed up lost and lucky. But here's the problem. Images, maps, and records say Africans were already here, and not as rumors, as documented visitors. Start with the maps. In 1513, the famous Ottoman admiral Piri compiled a world map using older sources, some dating back centuries. His map shows the Atlantic with shocking accuracy, including land across the ocean before Europe claims to have understood it. Piri Reis himself wrote that he used ancient maps and maps from the time of Alexander. That timeline doesn't match the Columbus story. Then there are the African featured figures carved into mech heads in Mesoamerica, dated between 1200 and 400 BC. Massive stone sculptures with broad noses, full lips, African physiognomy. Archaeologists argue over who they represent, but nobody can convincingly explain why those features appear if Africans had never crossed the Atlantic. And here's where imagery becomes dangerous again, because stone doesn't gossip, stone remembers. Spanish chroniclers in the early 1500s, including Vasco Núñez de Balboa, wrote about encountering black people living among indigenous populations in the Americas, not enslaved, not recently arrived, established, familiar to the land. That detail gets brushed aside real quick in textbooks. Why? Because it messes up the clean timeline. Then there's Mansa Musa again, because his shadow stretches far. West African and maritime knowledge didn't disappear just because Europe later dominated the seas. Mandi ships were described as massive, ocean-capable vessels. According to Arab historian al-Umari, Mansa Musa said his predecessor, Abu Bakr, the MS, launched fleets into the Atlantic around 1311 CE and never returned. That's not myth. That's recorded testimony. But notice something. When Europeans crossed oceans, it was called discovery. When Africans did it, it became legend, symbol, speculation, same evidence, different respect. And the images tell the same story. Early European illustrations of the New World sometimes include African-looking figures among indigenous peoples. Later editions quietly removed them. Same scenes, fewer Africans, because African presence in the Americas before slavery creates a problem no paintbrush can fix. If Africans were already here, then African Americans are not an accident of history. They're part of a longer story that predates change. And that idea is dangerous. So what happened? The images didn't disappear completely. They were marginalized, questioned, labeled controversial because outright erasure would have raised suspicion. Same playbook as before. Keep the artifact. Remove the confidence. African Americans aren't told this because it reframes arrival. It reframes belonging. It reframes the entire psychology of how we got here. Suddenly, survival isn't the beginning. Continuity is. And that's why this part of the story gets treated like conspiracy instead of history, because it threatens the emotional foundation of the American narrative. But here's the thing. Elders always knew if your presence needs a boat to explain it, someone's lying about the shoreline. So now ask yourself this. If images, maps, and records already suggest Africans reached the Americas before Columbus, what else about discovery was designed to make African Americans feel like late arrivals instead of original participants in the human story? And once you see Africans present in the Americas before Columbus, the next truth lands heavy. The repainting didn't stop in Europe. It crossed the ocean and got institutional in America, because a nation built on stolen land and stolen labor could not afford images of African authority anywhere in its foundation. So America followed Europe's blueprint almost immediately. Look at Theodore de Bry's engravings from the late 1500s, especially his illustrations for America. Oh, 1590, 1634. These images shaped how Europeans and later Americans imagined the New World. Africans appear in these scenes, but never as leaders. Always laboring, always secondary. Even when historical records show Africans serving as translators, explorers, and skilled navigators, debris visuals flatten them into bodies, not minds. That wasn't documentation. That was instruction. Now take Estebanico, also known as Estebanico, the African explorer who traveled with the Narvaez expedition in the 1530s. Spanish records describe him as a guide, linguist, and negotiator who often went ahead of European parties and made contact with indigenous nations. But in later illustrations, like 19th century depictions of the expedition, Estebanico is either minimized, unnamed, or absent entirely. The explorer becomes invisible. The African leadership disappears. Same man, same journey, different image. Move forward to the 1700s and early 1800s. Look at popular American paintings like John Trumbull's Historical Scenes or Emmanuel Lloyd's Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way. 1861 Africans appear, if at all, as background laborers watching history happen. Meanwhile, white figures dominate the center, the motion, the destiny. That's not accidental framing. That's narrative design. Even the landing of Columbus paintings by artists like John Vanderlyn, 1847, erase any hint of African presence despite documented African sailors traveling with Europeans and earlier African contact with the Americas. The scene is painted as pure European arrival into emptiness. No Africans, no continuity, just discovery. And once slavery becomes the official starting point, the imagery locks in. Take the slave market circa 1866. Illustrations and plantation paintings from the 19th century. Africans are shown stripped of individuality, stacked, inspected. No names, no history, no suggestion that these people descended from kings, scholars, or explorers. The image tells you exactly how far back you're allowed to look, not past the auction block. Even after emancipation, the repainting continued. Look at Harper's weekly illustrations during Reconstruction. African Americans are often drawn as disorderly, incapable of self-rule or requiring supervision. Meanwhile, white authority figures are drawn, composed, and paternal, same moment in time. Two different visual languages. That's not journalism. That's psychological conditioning. And when African means built towns, schools, and economies, Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Rosewood in Florida, there are almost no celebratory national images. When these places are destroyed, the images vanish altogether. Prosperity doesn't fit the picture America wanted to preserve. Hollywood later inherited the same brush. Early films like Birth of a Nation, 1915, cemented Africans and African Americans as threats, servants, or caricatures. Ancient African royalty never appeared. African wisdom never appeared. Biblical epics recast sacred history with pale faces, continuing the same repainting logic on a massive screen. New medium, same crime. So when we talk about ancient African royalty being repainted white, understand this wasn't an old mistake that stopped centuries ago. It evolved, it adapted, it crossed borders. Canvas turned into engraving, engraving turned into textbook, textbook turned into film, and African Amines grew up surrounded by images that quietly said, you arrived late, you lead never, and you belong nowhere near the center. That's why this matters now, because once you name the images, once you call out the illustrations, once you put dates and artists on the deception, the spell weakens. So here's the question that brings us forward. If America carefully chose which images of Africans to preserve and which ones to erase, or what happens when African Amines start curating their own visual archive? One that tells the whole truth instead of a managed one. And by the time paint, stone, books, and museums had done their work, the job wasn't finished. It just changed tools. Because in the 20th century, the most powerful paintbrush in the world wasn't held by an artist. It was held by a camera. Hollywood didn't invent the whitewashing. It industrialized it. Film did something older media couldn't. It moved. It spoke. It repeated itself millions of times in living rooms. And whatever it showed became real to people who never cracked a history book a day in their lives. Look at the timing. Right as African Americans are fighting for civil rights in the early 1900s, Hollywood explodes. And the first major historical epic America gives the world is The Birth of a Nation in 1915. A film that doesn't just erase African authority, it demonizes African presence entirely. Black people are either threats or children. White power is heroic, necessary, or ordained. That wasn't entertainment, that was instruction. And notice what never shows up on screen. Ancient African royalty, African empires, African scholars, African kings and queens who ruled long before Europe figured itself out. The absence is loud if you listen for it. When Hollywood does touch ancient history, the repainting comes back full force. Biblical epics like the Ten Commandments, 1956, or Ben-Hur, 1959, flood the screen with pale faces in African and Middle Eastern settings. Egypt is there. Africa is there. Africans are not. Same land, different humanity. Cleopatra becomes the perfect example. A queen ruling in North Africa in a region with deep African bloodlines portrayed over and over again as European beauty. Elizabeth Taylor in 1963, becomes the global image of Cleopatra, not because of evidence, because of comfort, because a powerful African woman ruling an empire unsettles the story. And Hollywood knows the power of repetition. Once a face is fixed on screen, it overrides statues, manuscripts, and paintings most people will never see. For African Americans, that means your first exposure to ancient greatness almost never looks like you. That's not accidental. Even when African Americans appear in historical films, it's usually at the point of trauma, slavery, struggle, survival, important stories, yes. But notice the pattern. Pain is allowed. Power is not, because power implies inheritance. And inheritance is dangerous in a country still trying to explain inequality as coincidence. Hollywood didn't need to repaint ancient kings directly. It simply refused to show them. And absence, when repeated long enough, does the same work as erasure. The message settles in quietly. Africa equals background. African Americans equal arrival through suffering. Authority belongs elsewhere. But here's what makes this moment different. Cameras aren't locked in one set of hands anymore. Screens aren't owned by one gatekeeper. The same way elders once passed truth in whispers, truth now moves digitally, visually, uncontrollably. And once African Americans start seeing accurate images of African royalty, leadership, and civilization side by side with the old lies, the contrast becomes undeniable. Hollywood's brush worked for a century because no one challenged it at scale. That era is ending. So here's the question we're walking into next. If film became the modern paintbrush that finished the whitewashing job, what happens when African Americans take control of the lens and start telling history with faces that can't be edited out? There's a moment when a long-standing story doesn't collapse, but it does stop standing comfortably. The confidence fades first. The certainty follows, and suddenly, the people who used to answer with one sentence start needing 5. That's how know the image is changing. In the last few years, as African presence in antiquity has resurfaced in mainstream conversation through documentaries, museum exhibits, and popular media, the response hasn't been loud denial. It's been careful engagement. Headlines lean on words like debate, context, and complex history. Explanations stretch, statements hedge, certainty softens. And that alone tells you something important has shifted. When Netflix released Queen Cleopatra in 2023, the reaction wasn't treated as a niche argument. Major outlets like BBC, The Guardian, and the New York Times covered it as a serious international conversation about history, imagery, and who gets to visualize the ancient world. The discussion wasn't framed as nonsense versus fact. It was framed as competing interpretations of the past, each carrying modern implications. That framing matters. Nobody argued that images don't matter. Nobody said representation is irrelevant. The disagreement lived in interpretation, not dismissal. And that's a very different posture than silence. A generation ago, the idea of African authority in antiquity could be brushed off without explanation. Today, it requires language, panels, statements, care. The same shift shows up in museum reporting. Over the past few years, outlets like Reuters, CNN, and Al-Azhar have documented European museums reassessing how African artifacts are displayed and described, particularly around restitution cases like the Ben and bronzes. What's notable isn't just the return of objects, it's the attention given to labels, descriptions, and historical framing. Because context is where power hides. you'll notice institutions rarely make bold admissions. Instead, they adjust tone, broader African context, evolving scholarship, ongoing research. These phrases aren't confrontational, but they aren't dismissive either. They signal negotiation, and negotiation only happens when the old version can't hold on its own anymore. For African Americans, this moment feels familiar. It's the stage right before narrative shifts, not when everyone agrees, but when nobody can fully shut the door, when the old explanation still exists, but it has to share space. And that's new. The news coverage reflects it. Less certainty, more calibration, less pretending the question doesn't exist, more effort spent managing it. Not because new evidence suddenly appeared, but because existing evidence is harder to ignore in a visual age. What's happening now isn't about replacing one myth with another. It's about widening the frame, allowing African presence in antiquity to exist without apology or exaggeration, letting African Americans see continuity without having to argue for its possibility. That's why the stage matters. Not because the work is finished, but because the image is no longer frozen. Once it starts moving again, it rarely stops where institutions would prefer. Memory doesn't wait for permission, and images once restored to circulation don't quietly return to storage. So, here's the question that carries us forward. As the modern world adjusts its language and its walls, who gets to decide what the restored image finally says and who it speaks to when it's seen clearly again? Let's ground this where it belongs. Once the image starts moving again, the work shifts from exposure to restoration, not emotional restoration, historical restoration, putting things back where they were deliberately removed. Because reclaiming African authority isn't about vibes or pride. It's about accuracy. What's happening now is that African presence in antiquity is being reinserted into the record with evidence attached. Names, dates, locations, comparative analysis. Scholars are revisiting old assumptions not because of pressure, but because the material no longer supports the old framing. Take Egypt again. Over the last few decades, physical anthropology, DNA studies, and population analysis have increasingly affirmed that ancient Nile Valley populations were indigenous Africans, not symbolic Africans, not influenced by African peoples whose descendants still live in the region today. That's not radical. That's continuity. Or look at medieval Europe's African saints and rulers. As archives are digitized, earlier versions of manuscripts and paintings are easier to compare. Scholars can now trace when skin tones were altered, when captions were shortened, when titles were changed. That comparison work is methodical, not ideological. And when comparisons happen, patterns emerge. That's why this moment feels different from past attempts to correct the record. It's not just storytelling. It's documentation catching up to itself. The same way restoration science revealed darker layers under paint, historical analysis is revealing missing layers under the narrative. For African Americans, this matters because it restores lineage without requiring belief. You're not being asked to accept a new story. You're being shown how an old one was interrupted. That's a crucial difference. Once that interruption is visible, African authority stops feeling exceptional and starts feeling structural. You begin to see African governance, scholarship, and statecraft as part of a long continuum rather than isolated peaks. And that reframes modern African American history too. Suddenly, resilience doesn't look like a miracle. It looks like inheritance under pressure. Community organization, oral tradition, spiritual systems, resistance strategies, these don't appear out of nowhere in the Americas. They carry patterns recognizable in earlier African societies. That's not romantic. That's traceable. This is also why institutions are moving cautiously. Restoration is harder to argue against than revelation. Once something is shown to have been altered, the question isn't whether it should be restored. It's how long it was allowed to stay altered in the first place. And that's where responsibility enters the conversation. Because restoring images isn't just about museums and textbooks. It's about how African Americans understand their place in the world, not as a people who entered history late, but as a people whose history was edited mid-sentence. That understanding doesn't demand outrage. It demands literacy. So here's the question that carries us forward. Once the record is restored and the image reflects the truth again, what does it require of us to actually live with that knowledge clearly, responsibly, and without distortion? Once the image is restored and the record is corrected, the story doesn't stay locked in museums or journals. It comes home into classrooms, into families, into how African Americans explain themselves without exaggeration, apology, or doubt. Because restored history changes expectations. Cheikh Anta Diop said it plainly decades ago. A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. That wasn't poetry. That was diagnosis. When African authority was removed from the record, African Americans weren't just miseducated. They were unrooted on purpose. And when roots are restored, certain questions disappear. You stop asking how African Americans survived so much pressure and start asking how systems of knowledge adapted under force. Survival stops looking like luck. It starts looking like continuity under constraint. That distinction matters. Anthropologist Melville Herskowitz wrote in The Myth of the Negro Past in 1941 that African cultural patterns in the Americas were not erased, only transformed. He documented how African governance models, kinship systems, and spiritual frameworks survived enslavement in altered form, not remembered perfectly, but remembered enough. That doesn't happen by accident. Look at mutual aid societies formed by African Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries. Scholars like Webb Dubois trace these organizations directly back to West African cooperative systems. In Black Reconstruction, Dubois reminded readers that African Americans did not enter history empty-handed. His words were sharp. The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. What often gets missed is that Dubois also emphasized how African organizational knowledge made even that brief moment possible. Structure survives even when images are stolen, or consider language and spirituality. Zora Neale Hurston, trained as an anthropologist, noted how African cosmology persisted in African American religious expression, especially in rhythm, call and response, and communal authority. She understood that culture travels even when textbooks don't. That's why restoring ancient imagery matters more than symbolism. Images teach without asking permission. When African Americans see African authority presented accurately, kings, scholars, lawgivers, it recalibrates what leadership feels like, what competence looks like, what inheritance means. James Baldwin once warned, "The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it. When history is distorted, that control works against you. When it's restored, it starts working for you." For generations, African Americans were denied visual reference points for authority, not just politically, psychologically, symbolically. And when those references return, even slowly, they shift how possibility is imagined. That's why this stage isn't about outrage, it's about responsibility. Because once the record is restored, it doesn't ask to be worshiped. It asks to be used in education, in parenting, in how questions get asked and answered, in how confidence shows up without needing volume. Restored history demands literacy, and literacy changes behavior quietly. You read museum labels differently. You notice what's missing in textbooks. You recognize when a story feels incomplete without needing to argue. That's how real change moves. Oh, not fast, but firmly. So here's the question that carries us forward. Once African Americans bring restored knowledge fully into daily life, backed by evidence, scholarship, and memory, how does that reshape the future in ways that don't need validation from the institutions that once erased it? And once the record comes home, once restored knowledge starts shaping how people see themselves day to day, the responsibility shifts. The question is no longer whether the truth exists. It's who carries it forward without letting it get edited again, because history doesn't preserve itself. Every generation decides what gets protected and what gets softened back into something safe. For centuries, those decisions were made inside. Institutions far removed from African American communities, institutions that inherited old assumptions along with old artifacts. That structure matters. We've seen this before. In 1839, when the British Museum formally opened its Egyptian galleries, African artifacts were displayed through a classical European lens. The objects were there, but the framing stripped them of African continuity. The same pattern repeated in 1795 at the Louvre, when revolutionary France rebranded looted African and Egyptian material as universal world heritage detached from the people who produced it. That wasn't neutrality. That was control. If African authority could be repainted once, it doesn't need paint to be reshaped again. Omission works just as well. So does categorization. So does calling African history supplemental. That modern containment echoes older practices almost exactly. Webb Dubois warned about this in 1935 in Black Reconstruction, writing that history is often written by those who have the power to write it. He wasn't talking about ignorance. He was talking about access, about who controls the archive. That's why stewardship matters. African Americans have always understood this instinctively. That's why HBCUCUS, beginning with Cheyney University in 1837 and Howard University in 1867, weren't just schools. They were repositories, places where African history could be studied without distortion, where scholars like Carter G. Woodson, who founded Negro History Week in 1926, could insist that African people were central to the human story, not marginal to it. Woodson put it plainly: if you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. That wasn't theory. That was observation. Fast forward to now. Digital access has shifted the terrain. Manuscripts once locked in Timbuktu, Rome, London are being digitized. Comparative image analysis, early versus restored paintings, original engravings versus later reproductions is now possible in minutes. That changes who gets to verify the record, and verification creates accountability. James Baldwin warned in 1965, history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. If that's true, and it is, then guarding the truth isn't optional. It's a responsibility that shapes behavior, policy, and expectation. This is where maturity enters the conversation. Guarding the truth doesn't mean turning history into ideology. It means refusing to let it be flattened again. It means teaching complexity without surrendering continuity, accuracy without replacement, myths, evidence without apology. That's elder work. Because elders know truth doesn't need decoration. It needs protection. Well, quiet, steady protection that survives trend, cycles, and institutional discomfort. So here's the question that takes us into the final stretch. Now that African Americans have access to names, dates, images, and receipts once kept out of reach, what does it mean to become the long-term guardians of that truth so it can never be repainted again? And once the truth is guarded, once the record is no longer drifting and at the mercy of institutions that didn't build it, there's one final step left. Not exposure, not debate, decision. Because every restored history eventually reaches a moment where someone has to decide whether it will be protected or quietly altered again when attention moves on. That's where this generation stands. History has always been revised, but who controls the revision determines what survives. For centuries, that control lived inside European mies, churches, museums, and publishing houses. That's why African authority could be softened without resistance. But the conditions that allow that are changing now. Why? Not because of outrage, but because of access. In 1987, historian John Henry Clark said, "History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day." When African time was removed from that clock, African amines were made to feel late, misplaced, disconnected. Restoring that time doesn't just correct the past, it reorients the present. By the early 2000s, restoration science and archival digitization began exposing what earlier generations could only suspect. X-ray imaging revealed darker underpaintings beneath European restorations. Early engravings could be compared side by side with later versions. Manuscripts once locked away became searchable. The edits stopped being theoretical. They became visible. And once edits are visible, they can't be undone quietly. Kwame Nkrumah warned in 1964, "A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots." But roots don't just nourish pride. They stabilize growth. They determine how far a people can stretch without breaking. This moment isn't about replacing one myth with another. It's about accuracy, becoming normal. African authority no longer treated as an exception or curiosity, but as part of a continuous human record that was interrupted, not imagined. That understanding changes posture. You stop asking to be included in history. You start asking who's editing it. You stop reacting emotionally and start verifying carefully. You don't argue as much because you recognize patterns instead of chasing approval. That's literacy. And literacy doesn't shout, it steadies. It makes you patient where others get defensive, precise where others generalize. Because once you understand how African royalty was repainted before, you know exactly what to watch for when new versions of the story appear. The last edit isn't dramatic. It's discipline. It shows up in how history is taught, in how images are labeled, and how children are introduced to the past without distortion or spectacle. It's the refusal to let African authority be treated as a footnote. Again, not through confrontation, but through consistency. So, when you step back and look at the whole picture, the pattern is clear. African royalty wasn't erased because it was unclear. It was altered because it was undeniable. Paint was changed. Stone was damaged. Timelines were shifted. Labels were softened. And generation by generation, the image was edited just enough to disconnect African Americans from a lineage of authority, governance, and continuity. What's happening now isn't a discovery. It's a correction. The record is being realigned with the evidence that was always there. And once you see how the edits were made, you also see how fragile they were. Because truth doesn't disappear. It waits. And now that the image is visible again, intact, contextualized, and undeniable, the responsibility isn't to argue about it. It's to remember it accurately, teach it carefully, and make sure it is never repainted.